The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel glittered under rows of crystal chandeliers, and every eye in the crowded room turned toward the woman standing quietly near the wall the moment Victoria Carter lifted the microphone and laughed into it. "Is this really the woman my husband used to be married to?" Victoria said, her voice sweet with contempt, drawing every gaze in the room toward the corner where Naomi stood. "I suppose I always assumed he had better taste before he met me." Laughter rippled through the crowd, some genuine, some nervous, but all of it aimed like a blade at the woman standing perfectly still beside the water table. Naomi Brooks set down her glass without a sound and turned to leave, refusing to give the room the reaction it clearly wanted from her. But before she could take a single step, an elderly woman rose from her seat near the front, her cane striking the marble floor with a force that silenced the laughter instantly. "No one in this room will speak to her that way again." The voice belonged to Evelyn Carter, mother of the groom, and the ballroom went cold around her words. Within minutes, a sealed envelope that had waited more than 30 years would be opened, carrying inside it a truth large enough to shatter the entire Carter family from the inside out. The gala had been planned for months, a lavish celebration marking 20 years since Carter Industries first opened its doors, and the guest list read like a registry of the city's wealthiest families. Daniel Carter arrived with Victoria on his arm, the two of them dressed as though they had stepped directly out of a magazine spread, and photographers lined the entrance to capture the moment the golden couple walked in together. Daniel was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, silver already creeping into his temples, and he wore success the way other men wore expensive cologne, applying it liberally so that everyone around him would notice. Victoria was 36, younger, sharper in her ambitions, and she moved through the room collecting compliments the way a child collects candy at a parade. Naomi had been invited only because she still held a small number of shares from the early years of the company, a courtesy extended by the board rather than any personal warmth from Daniel himself. She arrived alone, dressed simply in navy blue, her posture calm and unhurried, carrying herself the way a woman does when she has already survived worse rooms than this one. It took Victoria only minutes to spot her across the crowd, and something in her expression sharpened the instant recognition settled in. Victoria crossed the room with practiced grace, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that seemed designed to announce her arrival before she even spoke a word. "Naomi, is that really you?" she said, tilting her head as though genuinely surprised, though everyone nearby could sense the performance underneath it. She looked Naomi up and down slowly, letting her eyes linger on the plain cut of the dress, the absence of jewelry, the simplicity that Naomi wore like armor rather than apology. "I love that you still shop the same way," Victoria added, smiling at the small cluster of guests who had begun to gather nearby, sensing entertainment the way sharks sense blood in open water. Naomi said nothing, her expression unreadable, and that silence seemed to irritate Victoria more than any retort could have. "I always wondered what Daniel saw in someone so, well, modest," Victoria continued, raising her glass slightly, as though offering a toast to a joke only she found funny. The guests around them exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to laugh along or quietly step away from the growing tension in the air. Naomi finally spoke, her voice low and even, carrying no anger in it at all. "There are worse things to be than modest, Victoria," she said simply, and turned her attention back to her drink as though the conversation had already ended for her. Victoria was not finished, and the crowd around them seemed to sense it before she even opened her mouth again. "Some people just need to know when they belong to the past," she said loudly enough for at least a dozen guests to hear clearly, her tone dressed in false sweetness that fooled no one paying close attention. A few nervous laughs followed, quickly stifled when Naomi simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a weather report rather than an insult. Daniel stood only a few feet away, deep in conversation with two board members, and though he clearly heard his wife's comment, he made no move to intervene or correct her. His silence spoke volumes to everyone watching, confirming what many already suspected about where his loyalties now rested. Naomi felt the weight of that silence more than she felt the sting of Victoria's words, because indifference from someone who once promised forever cuts in a way that mockery from a stranger never could. She had learned long ago that dignity was not something other people could hand to her or take away, no matter how loudly they tried. So she simply lifted her chin, met Victoria's eyes without flinching, and let the silence between them stretch until it became Victoria's burden to carry instead of her own. Nearby, A small cluster of guests who had known Naomi and Daniel since the company's early years exchanged uneasy glances, none of them quite willing to intervene directly, but all of them clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. One older gentleman, a longtime supplier who had worked with the family since before the company had its first real office, muttered under his breath that some people never learned the difference between confidence and cruelty. His wife nudged him quietly, urging him not to get involved, though her own expression betrayed the same discomfort. A young marketing associate, newly hired and eager to make a good impression, whispered to a colleague that she had heard stories about the founder's first wife but never expected to witness anything like this in person. The colleague replied that stories rarely captured the full truth of a situation, and that watching it unfold firsthand felt entirely different from hearing it secondhand over lunch. Meanwhile, Victoria, sensing the shift in mood but misreading its cause entirely, assumed the silence around her signaled approval rather than growing disapproval. She smiled toward a nearby photographer, striking a practiced pose as though the tension in the room existed only in her own imagination. 20 years earlier, Naomi and Daniel had started with almost nothing, sharing a cramped apartment above a laundromat and dreaming out loud about a company that existed only on napkins and borrowed hope. Naomi worked 3 jobs during those early years, waitressing through breakfast shifts, doing bookkeeping for a dental office in the afternoons, and cleaning offices at night, while Daniel poured every waking hour into building something from nothing. When the business needed capital it did not have, Naomi sold the only car they owned without complaint, understanding instinctively that sacrifice was simply what love required in seasons like that one. She mortgaged the small condominium her grandmother had left her, signing away security for a gamble that had no guarantees attached to it whatsoever. For nearly 4 years, she managed the company's books without taking a single dollar in salary, insisting that every cent stay inside the business until it could stand on its own. Daniel used to tell people, back then, that Naomi was the reason the company survived its first winter, though somewhere along the way he had quietly stopped telling that story altogether. There had been a particular evening, years before any of the wealth arrived, when the two of them sat on the floor of their tiny apartment surrounded by unpaid bills, trying to decide which ones absolutely had to be settled that month and which could wait another few weeks. Naomi had taken Daniel's hand across the scattered papers and told him, with a conviction that never wavered even once, that she believed in what he was building more than she believed in comfort or security for herself. She remembered the exact smell of the second-hand furniture in their first real office, a converted garage that leaked whenever it rained, and how she used to bring soup from home so Daniel would eat something warm during the long nights spent chasing investors. On their 5th wedding anniversary, unable to afford even a modest dinner out, they had celebrated instead with grocery store cake and a bottle of inexpensive wine, laughing together on the fire escape until well past midnight. Naomi kept a small notebook from those years, filled with handwritten projections and client names, evidence of countless hours spent helping Daniel refine pitches that eventually secured the funding the company desperately needed to survive. She never once asked for her name to appear anywhere in the official paperwork, content instead to watch quietly from the background as the business slowly took shape around them. Looking back, she would later admit to herself that those difficult years, despite their hardship, had contained a closeness with Daniel that all the wealth afterward somehow never managed to replace. Success, when it finally arrived, changed Daniel in ways that crept in slowly enough that Naomi almost did not notice until the damage had already been done. He began staying late at the office, for reasons that had less to do with work and more to do with the version of himself he was building in rooms Naomi was no longer invited into. Dinners with investors turned into dinners that stretched past midnight, and phone calls grew shorter and more guarded, punctuated by silences that used to be filled with laughter between them. He started caring, deeply and visibly, about how the company appeared to outsiders, about the watches he wore and the car he drove and the woman standing beside him at industry functions. It was at one such function that he met Victoria, then a junior marketing consultant hired to help rebrand the company for its next chapter of growth. Victoria had noticed Daniel long before he ever noticed her, studying the way he carried himself in meetings and calculating, with quiet precision, exactly how she might make herself indispensable to a man who clearly craved admiration more than comfort. She complimented his vision in front of clients, remembered small details about his preferences that even Naomi had long stopped mentioning aloud, and made herself available at hours when a marriage already strained by distance left obvious openings for someone patient enough to wait. Daniel, flattered by attention that felt fresh and uncomplicated compared to the quiet steadiness he had grown used to at home, told himself repeatedly that nothing improper was happening between them, even as the late meetings grew more frequent and less necessary. By the time Naomi began to sense that something had changed, the shift had already progressed far beyond anything a single honest conversation could easily repair. She asked him directly, one evening after he returned home well past midnight, smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, whether there was someone else occupying his attention. Daniel had denied it flatly, his voice sharp with a defensiveness that, in hindsight, told her everything his words tried to conceal. Within a year, the marriage that had survived years of hardship together could not survive a single year of comfort, and Daniel filed for divorce with a lawyer Naomi had never even heard mentioned before. She walked away from 20 years of shared history with nothing but 2 suitcases and a signature on a settlement that barely covered her legal fees. Back in the ballroom, the story of that history had begun circulating quietly among guests who remembered the early years, murmured in careful whispers between old friends and former colleagues who had watched it all unfold firsthand. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and said softly that she remembered when Naomi used to bring homemade lunches to the office just so Daniel could save money for payroll. Another guest recalled how Naomi had once stayed awake 3 straight nights preparing financial documents for a bank loan that ultimately saved the company from collapse entirely. As these small fragments of memory spread from one cluster of guests to another, something in the room's mood began to shift almost imperceptibly. Where sympathy had once belonged only to Victoria as the glamorous new wife, admiration now quietly redirected itself toward the woman standing calmly by the wall. Victoria, sensing the shift but not yet understanding its full weight, pressed forward with even greater determination to reclaim the room's attention for herself. She raised her voice again, louder this time, clearly intent on finishing what she had started in front of everyone present. "I do hope you're doing all right these days, Naomi," Victoria said, tilting her head with exaggerated concern that fooled absolutely no one standing nearby. "I imagine it must be difficult, still renting after all these years, especially watching everything Daniel and I have built together." The comment landed with an audible hush, several guests turning away in visible discomfort at the cruelty wrapped so thinly in false sympathy. Naomi allowed a small, genuine smile to form on her face before she answered, her voice carrying none of the bitterness Victoria clearly hoped to provoke. "I sleep very well every night, Victoria," she said simply, "which is more than I can say for people who need an audience to feel secure." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearby guests, and this time it was not aimed at Naomi at all. Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment before she forced it back into place, raising her glass as though nothing had happened, though something clearly had shifted in that exchange. Daniel, still standing several feet away, finally turned his head, but by then the damage to his wife's composure had already been done in front of everyone who mattered. Determined to recover the ground she felt slipping away from her, Victoria pressed her point further, stepping closer to Naomi with a smile that no longer reached her eyes. "It must be strange for you, watching everything Daniel built now belong to someone else entirely," she said, her voice carrying an edge that betrayed her growing frustration. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying Victoria with the calm curiosity of someone observing a pattern she had seen play out many times before in different rooms with different people. "Nothing that was ever truly mine has stopped belonging to me, Victoria," she replied evenly, "and nothing you say tonight will change that." Several guests nearby exchanged glances, sensing that the balance of power in this exchange had shifted decisively, though Victoria herself seemed either unable or unwilling to recognize it. She opened her mouth once more, searching for another remark sharp enough to reclaim the room's attention, but nothing arrived quickly enough to prevent the silence from stretching uncomfortably around her. A member of the catering staff, passing nearby with a tray of appetizers, later admitted to a colleague that she had never seen someone so thoroughly outmatched while holding all the apparent advantages in a conversation. Victoria retreated toward the bar to refill her glass, muttering something under her breath about people who took themselves far too seriously, unaware that the true reckoning of the evening had not yet even begun. Across the room, Evelyn Carter had been watching the entire exchange unfold with an expression that seemed increasingly troubled as the minutes passed. She was 72 years old, elegant in a deep emerald gown, her silver hair swept back in the same simple style she had worn for decades. Unlike the rest of the room, Evelyn's eyes were not fixed on Victoria's performance but on Naomi herself, tracking her with a kind of quiet guilt that had nothing to do with the present conversation. Her hands trembled slightly around the handle of her cane, and more than once she reached for her water glass only to set it down again untouched. When Daniel finally approached his mother to check on her, concerned by her unusual stillness, she waved him off with a tired gesture. "Mother, are you feeling all right?" he asked, crouching slightly beside her chair with genuine worry in his voice. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before answering, her expression carrying something between sorrow and resolve. "You will understand soon enough, Daniel," she said quietly, and then turned her gaze back toward Naomi, as though bracing herself for something only she could see coming. Evelyn had said nothing more to her son that evening, but her mind had already made its decision the moment Victoria's laughter first cut through the room. She excused herself from the table and made her way, slowly and deliberately, toward a quiet corner near the coat check, where a familiar figure waited with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Jonathan Reed had served as the Carter family's attorney for nearly 30 years, and in all that time, Evelyn had asked him for very few personal favors. Tonight, however, she asked him plainly, without hesitation, whether he still had access to the sealed envelope stored in the family vault since the year Daniel's father passed away. Jonathan's expression grew serious as he nodded, confirming that the envelope remained exactly where it had been left, untouched and unopened for more than 3 decades. Jonathan Reed had joined the Carter family as their attorney back when Robert was still building the company from a single rented office, and over the following 30 years he had witnessed nearly every significant decision the family ever made, both public and private. He had drafted Robert's original will, then later the private addendum, and he had never once questioned Evelyn's decision to keep the second document sealed, understanding that grief sometimes required decades rather than months to properly settle. He remembered Robert's final weeks clearly, the labored breathing, the insistence on finishing the addendum by hand rather than dictating it, as though the physical act of writing carried a weight typed words never could. Jonathan had promised Robert, quietly and privately, that he would honor Evelyn's judgment about when, or if, the document should ever see daylight again. Watching Naomi endure Victoria's mockery earlier that evening had reminded him uncomfortably of a promise he had nearly begun to think might never be fulfilled at all. Now, standing beside Evelyn in the quiet corner of the ballroom, he felt something close to relief that the waiting had finally come to an end. "Are you certain you want to do this tonight, Evelyn?" he asked carefully, aware of the weight such a decision would carry once set into motion. Evelyn looked back toward the ballroom, toward her son standing beside a woman who had just humiliated someone who deserved far better treatment, and her answer came without hesitation. "I have carried this silence long enough," she said. "Tonight, it ends." Jonathan left the ballroom briefly to retrieve the envelope from the hotel's private security office, where it had been transported earlier that week for an entirely different legal matter concerning the family trust. When he returned, he carried it carefully, as though its thin paper concealed something far heavier than ink and signatures could ever suggest. Evelyn instructed him to wait near the small stage at the front of the room, promising that the right moment would present itself soon enough. She returned to her table, folding her hands in her lap, watching Victoria continue her quiet campaign of cruelty with a patience that came only from decades of practice. Guests nearby noticed the tension building in Evelyn's posture, though few understood its true source, assuming instead that she was simply tired from the long evening. Daniel, still unaware of what his mother had just set into motion, returned to his conversation with the board members, believing the earlier tension between his wife and his ex-wife had already passed. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, a truth he had never been told would rise to the surface and rewrite everything he believed about his own family. Victoria, emboldened by the lack of consequence for her earlier comments, decided the evening's entertainment was not yet complete. She approached Naomi one final time, this time raising her glass in an exaggerated toast meant to draw the attention of every remaining guest still watching. "Let's toast to new beginnings," she announced loudly, "and to knowing when it's time to let go of things that no longer belong to you." The room fell into an uncomfortable hush, waiting to see how Naomi would respond to such a direct and public provocation. Naomi did not raise her glass. Instead, she looked at Victoria with an expression of calm pity rather than anger, the kind of look reserved for someone who did not yet understand the consequences of their own cruelty. "You should be careful what you wish to let go of, Victoria," she said quietly. "Some things come back to remind you exactly what you tried to bury." Before Victoria could respond, a sharp sound echoed across the marble floor, the unmistakable strike of a cane against stone, and every head in the room turned toward Evelyn Carter as she rose slowly to her feet. "That is enough," Evelyn said, her voice carrying with a strength that surprised even those who had known her for years. The room fell completely silent, waiters pausing mid-step, conversations dying instantly as every eye turned toward the elderly woman standing at the center of it all. Victoria opened her mouth to offer some dismissive remark, but something in Evelyn's expression stopped the words before they could leave her lips. "You will not speak to this woman that way again." Evelyn continued, each word deliberate and unhurried, "Not in my presence, and certainly not at an event bearing my late husband's name." Daniel stepped forward, confused and increasingly alarmed by his mother's uncharacteristic outburst. "Mother, what is going on?" he asked, his voice low, aware that every guest in the room was now watching their family with rapt attention. Evelyn turned to face her son directly, her eyes glistening with decades of unspoken guilt finally rising to the surface. "There is something your father left behind," she said, "something I should have given to Naomi a very long time ago." She nodded toward Jonathan, who stepped forward from the shadows near the stage, the sealed envelope held firmly in his hands. The room watched in stunned silence as Jonathan Reed approached the small podium at the front of the ballroom, the sealed envelope resting carefully atop his leather folder. Daniel's father, Robert Carter, had passed away nearly 31 years earlier, at a time when the company was still fragile and the family's future remained deeply uncertain. In the final months of his illness, Robert had drafted a private addendum to his will, separate from the official documents distributed to the family after his death. Jonathan explained, his voice steady despite the tension in the room, that Robert had specified very clear conditions surrounding this particular document. If Naomi remained married into the family at any point when the addendum was read, full authority over a private family trust would transfer directly to her, based entirely on his personal trust in her character. Robert had written, in his own words, that he believed Naomi possessed an honesty within the family that he valued above any accumulated wealth or business success. The addendum had never been read publicly, sealed away in the family vault under an agreement that only Evelyn held the authority to release it. Jonathan explained further that Robert had structured the condition with unusual precision, insisting that the document remain sealed unless a specific set of circumstances arose exactly as he had described them in writing. He had not wanted the addendum released, simply out of sentiment or convenience, understanding that such a powerful document, if misused, could easily become a tool for manipulation rather than justice. Instead, he had trusted his wife's judgment entirely, believing that Evelyn alone would recognize the moment when honoring his wishes mattered more than protecting the family's public image. For 3 decades, that moment had never arrived, or perhaps Evelyn had simply never allowed herself to see it clearly until tonight. Several guests near the front of the room leaned forward, straining to hear every word, sensing that whatever legal formality Jonathan was describing carried consequences reaching far beyond simple inheritance. Daniel's own attorney, present that evening as a guest rather than in any official capacity, quietly confirmed to a nearby board member that such addendums, while unusual, were entirely enforceable under state law when properly witnessed and notarized. The confirmation seemed to settle any lingering doubt among the guests that what they were witnessing was mere theater rather than genuine legal consequence. Daniel stood frozen as Jonathan carefully broke the seal on the envelope, extracting several pages of yellowed paper covered in his father's familiar handwriting. He had spent his entire adult life believing he understood his father completely, yet here was a document proving an entire dimension of the man's private thoughts had remained hidden from him for over 3 decades. Jonathan began reading aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Robert had written extensively about watching Naomi during the company's earliest and most desperate years, describing her sacrifices in detail that Daniel himself had somehow forgotten over time. He recalled how she skipped meals to save grocery money for payroll, how she sat beside his hospital bed through countless sleepless nights during his own battle with illness years earlier, and how she never once complained, despite everything she carried. Daniel's hands trembled as memories long buried began resurfacing with painful clarity, memories he had allowed ambition and comfort to erase from his daily thoughts. He remembered now, vividly, the exhausted look on Naomi's face after 12-hour shifts, the quiet strength she carried without ever asking for recognition or reward. He thought of the winter his father had first fallen seriously ill, when Naomi had rearranged her entire schedule without complaint to sit beside Robert's hospital bed every single evening after her own long day of work had ended. She had learned to manage his medications, memorized the names of every doctor on his care team, and often stayed so late that she fell asleep in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed rather than drive home exhausted in the middle of the night. Daniel remembered visiting during those weeks and finding her there each time, her hand resting gently over his father's, speaking softly to him even when the medications kept him from fully responding. He had thanked her then, briefly and somewhat absently, already distracted by a merger negotiation that seemed at the time far more urgent than it did now standing in this ballroom years later. Robert had recovered from that illness, only to pass away several years afterward from an unrelated condition. But the bond formed during those difficult weeks had clearly never faded from his father's memory, even if it had slowly faded from his own. Standing there now, holding proof of his father's enduring gratitude in the form of a legal document, Daniel understood with painful clarity just how much he had allowed himself to forget. Victoria's confidence, so absolute only minutes earlier, had begun visibly crumbling as Jonathan continued reading from the pages in his hands. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice noticeably thinner than before. "These are just old papers written decades ago. They mean nothing now." But Jonathan continued undeterred, turning to the final page of the document, where Robert's handwriting grew slightly unsteady, likely written during his final weeks of illness. In this last section, Robert had included a handwritten letter addressed directly to whoever might one day read this addendum aloud. If a day should come when Naomi is treated unjustly by this family, the letter read, "Let this document restore to her the dignity and respect she has always deserved." The room fell into a silence so complete that the soft rustle of paper seemed almost deafening against it. Victoria's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness replaced entirely by visible panic as the true weight of the situation settled over her. Even Daniel, normally composed in any social setting, found himself unable to speak, staring at his father's handwriting as though seeing the man for the very first time. Evelyn stepped forward once more, her voice trembling now with emotion she had suppressed for over 30 years. "There is something more you all need to understand," she said, looking directly at her son with an expression of profound sorrow. "When you filed for divorce from Naomi, you believed she had grown distant, that she no longer cared about this family or its future." Daniel nodded slowly, uncertain where his mother's words were leading, though something in his stomach had already begun tightening with dread. "The truth," Evelyn continued, her voice breaking slightly, "is that I knew about Victoria long before your divorce was finalized, and I said nothing." Gasps rippled through the crowd of guests, many of whom had known the Carter family for years and had never imagined such a confession possible. "I watched Victoria insert herself into your life while you were still married to Naomi," Evelyn admitted, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "And I stayed silent because I believed silence would protect this family's reputation." Daniel turned slowly toward Victoria, whose face had drained of all color, her earlier confidence entirely replaced by visible fear. "Is this true?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice barely audible, even in the silent room, directed at the woman he had married only 18 months earlier. Victoria opened her mouth to deny it, but the words seemed to catch somewhere in her throat, unable to escape under the weight of so many watching eyes. Evelyn answered for her instead, her voice steadier now, though clearly exhausted from carrying this secret for so long. "I carried this guilt for years, watching Naomi lose everything while the truth remained buried," she said, turning to look directly at Naomi for the first time that evening. "You were never at fault for this marriage ending, Naomi, and I am deeply, deeply sorry it took me this long to say so publicly." The entire room seemed to shift its collective sympathy entirely in that moment. Guests who had laughed along with Victoria's earlier jokes, now looking away from her in visible discomfort. Daniel stood motionless, staring at his mother, then at Victoria, then, finally, at Naomi, as though trying to reconcile three entirely different versions of his own life story all at once. For the first time all evening, every eye in the room turned not toward Victoria's performance, but toward Naomi's quiet, steady composure. Naomi finally stepped forward, her voice calm despite the storm of emotion swirling through the room around her. "I want everyone here to understand something clearly," she began, her tone gentle but unwavering. "I do not hate Daniel, and I feel no need for revenge against Victoria, no matter what has just been revealed." The room listened intently, the earlier tension slowly replaced by a different kind of stillness, one born of genuine attention rather than scandal. "What hurt me most," Naomi continued, "was never the divorce itself, or even losing everything I helped build over so many years." She paused, glancing briefly at Evelyn before continuing. What hurt most was living for years without anyone acknowledging the truth, without anyone standing up to say that I had done nothing wrong. Daniel took a step toward her, his expression filled with a regret so visible it seemed to age him several years in an instant. "Naomi, I am so sorry," he said quietly, his voice breaking on the final word. Victoria, too, finally spoke, her earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling genuine shame. "I'm sorry as well," she said softly, though the words seemed to cost her considerable effort to say aloud. Naomi looked at both of them for a long moment before responding, her expression neither cold nor forgiving, simply honest. "Some apologies arrive far too late to undo what has already been done," she said quietly, "but I appreciate that you found the courage to say them tonight, in front of everyone." She turned then toward Jonathan, who still held the remaining pages of Robert Carter's addendum in his careful hands. "What exactly does this document mean for the trust in practical terms?" she asked, her tone businesslike despite the emotional weight of the evening. Jonathan explained that, according to Robert's wishes, full authority over a substantial family trust now legally rested with Naomi, along with several symbolic items Robert had specifically designated for her. Among these was a family ring, passed down through 3 generations of Carter women, along with a personal letter Robert had written specifically for Naomi to read whenever this moment finally arrived. The ballroom watched in complete silence as Jonathan retrieved these final items from his folder, placing them gently into Naomi's waiting hands. Daniel watched his ex-wife hold the ring that had once belonged to his own grandmother, understanding fully now the depth of what he had carelessly discarded years earlier. Naomi opened the letter slowly, reading it silently to herself first before deciding, after a long pause, to share its contents aloud with the room. Robert had written, in careful and deliberate handwriting, that he considered Naomi as much his daughter as if she had been born into the family herself. He praised her integrity, her quiet strength during the company's most difficult years, and her refusal to ever ask for recognition despite everything she had sacrificed. The letter closed with a simple request, one that seemed to settle gently over the entire room like a long overdue exhale. Robert asked that, whatever circumstances led to this letter finally being read, Naomi used whatever authority came with it not for personal gain, but to help others who found themselves without a voice of their own. Naomi folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest for a long moment before addressing the silent room once more. "I have no interest in claiming power over this family's finances," she said clearly, her voice steady and certain. "What I want instead is to honor what Robert truly believed in, using this trust to help people who need it far more than I ever will." With Jonathan's assistance, Naomi outlined her decision on the spot, choosing to transfer full administrative control of the trust to a nonprofit foundation dedicated to scholarships and support programs for women facing financial hardship. The room listened in stunned admiration as she explained her reasoning, honoring exactly the spirit Robert had described in his letter decades earlier. Daniel watched her with an expression that mixed grief, admiration, and profound regret all at once, finally understanding the full measure of what he had lost when their marriage ended. He realized, standing there in front of everyone who had once celebrated his marriage to Victoria, that what he had truly lost was never measured in money or status at all. It was the quiet partnership of someone who had built an entire life alongside him from absolutely nothing, asking for nothing in return except honesty and respect. Victoria, meanwhile, stood increasingly isolated near the edge of the room, the earlier admiration she had commanded from guests, now replaced entirely by uncomfortable silence directed her way. Within minutes, she quietly gathered her belongings and left the ballroom without another word, unable to face the consequences of her own arrogance any longer. No one moved to stop her, and no one seemed particularly troubled by her sudden departure from the celebration. Evelyn approached Naomi slowly, tears still visible on her weathered face, and wrapped her arms around the woman she had once considered a daughter in every sense but blood. "You never stopped being family to me," she whispered, her voice thick with decades of regret finally finding release. Naomi returned the embrace warmly, without hesitation, understanding that forgiveness, when offered honestly, mattered more than any grudge she might have carried instead. "Thank you for finally telling the truth tonight," Naomi said softly, even though it took far longer than either of us would have wanted. Around them, the ballroom slowly began returning to its normal rhythm, though the mood had shifted entirely from celebration into something quieter and more reflective. Guests spoke in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed, many expressing quiet admiration for the grace Naomi had shown throughout an evening designed specifically to humiliate her. Daniel remained standing at a distance, watching his mother and his former wife together, understanding fully now that some mistakes could never be undone no matter how much wealth or success a person accumulated afterward. He did not approach again that evening, sensing correctly that Naomi needed no further words from him to feel whole. As the evening drew to its close, Naomi made her way toward the hotel's entrance alone, declining offers from several guests to accompany her or arrange transportation home. She stepped outside into the cool evening air, the golden light of early evening spilling across the pavement in long, quiet stretches. For the first time in years, she felt the true weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders, replaced instead by something lighter, something resembling genuine peace. She had not sought revenge against Daniel or Victoria, and she had not claimed the wealth that had briefly, legally, belonged entirely to her. What she carried instead, walking away from that glittering ballroom, was something far more valuable than any trust fund or inheritance could ever provide. She carried her dignity, fully restored in front of everyone who had once doubted her worth, and the quiet knowledge that truth, however long delayed, always eventually finds its way into the light. Naomi Brooks did not look back as she walked toward her car that evening, understanding fully that some victories require no audience at all to feel complete. The Carter family's carefully guarded secret had finally been spoken aloud, and with it, 30 years of silence had at last come to an end. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened at the gala spread quietly through the circles that had once treated Naomi as an afterthought, and the shift in how people regarded her became impossible to ignore. Former colleagues who had lost touch with her over the years began reaching out, some offering apologies of their own for staying silent during the years she had been so easily dismissed. The foundation Naomi established in her father-in-law's memory grew faster than anyone anticipated, receiving its first round of applications from young women seeking scholarships within days of its public announcement. She spent her mornings reviewing applications personally, insisting on reading every essay herself rather than delegating the task entirely to staff, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be overlooked by people with the power to change her circumstances. Evelyn visited often, sitting beside Naomi during these reviewing sessions, finding in the work a kind of quiet redemption for the silence she had carried for so many years. Daniel, meanwhile, stepped back gradually from the day-to-day operations of the company, choosing instead to spend more time trying to rebuild whatever relationship still remained possible with his mother and, eventually, with Naomi herself. Their friendship, when it slowly reformed, carried none of the old romance, but something perhaps more durable, a mutual respect built on hard-won honesty rather than convenient silence. Victoria disappeared from the social circle she had once dominated, her absence from subsequent company events noted quietly but without much surprise among those who remembered the gala clearly. Some heard she had moved to another city entirely, seeking a fresh start away from a community that no longer offered her the admiration she had once demanded so loudly. Whatever became of her, the story that mattered most was no longer about her downfall, but about the woman who had refused to let cruelty define her response to it. Naomi often said, in the years that followed, that the gala had taught her something she wished she had understood far earlier in her life. Dignity, she came to believe, was never something that could be taken by another person's laughter, no matter how loud or how public the humiliation seemed at the time. It could only be surrendered, and she had simply chosen, that evening and every evening afterward, not to surrender hers to anyone. The story of the Carter family gala eventually became something people told each other quietly, not as gossip, but as a reminder that truth, however delayed, has a way of finding its own moment to finally speak.